I walked into the lobby of my husband's office building at exactly 8:37 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, holding a bouquet of pink lilies that I had picked myself from the farmer's market on Fifth Avenue, because I wanted to surprise him for no reason at all, and maybe make him smile, like he used to when we first met back in 1987 when he worked at that tiny electronics shop on Main Street in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and I was 16 and had just gotten my first job at the ice cream parlor near the train station. But the moment I turned the corner and saw him, I froze, because he wasn't alone, and the woman with him wasn't someone I knew or even recognized. She was wearing a bright red coat that looked way too expensive for a Tuesday morning, and she had that laugh that cuts through you like glass, and I could hear from 20 feet away, and my hand shook so badly I almost dropped the lilies. And he saw me and smiled, but it wasn't a smile he used to give me. It was a smile full of secrets. And when he waved me over, the words came out of his mouth like they were rehearsed. "Oh, hey, honey, this is just my colleague. Sarah, we're working on a project together." But my stomach dropped to the floor, because the way he looked at her, it wasn't about a project. It was about something else. And in that exact moment, I felt 15 years of shared life and 3 houses worth of memories crumble around me, and the clock on the lobby wall said 8:42 a.m., and I realized that in less than 5 minutes, everything I thought I knew was about to change forever. And I thought about the time we spent renovating the kitchen in our Wilshire Heights house in Los Angeles, when I spent weekends sanding cabinets and paying for half the appliances with my bonus from the consulting firm while he was busy at work. And now here he was laughing with someone else, like I was invisible, and my chest tightened and my knees wobbled, and a little voice inside me whispered, "This isn't real, this isn't happening." But it was happening, and in exactly 15 minutes, I would have to decide whether to walk up to them and demand the truth, or run out of the building and pretend I had never seen anything. And the smell of fresh coffee from the lobby cafe mingled with the perfume of the red coat, and it felt like a cruel joke, because just last week I had bought him a set of custom cufflinks for his promotion at the firm, and now they meant nothing, and I wanted to scream and cry at the same time, and my hand accidentally brushed the edge of the marble counter, and it was cold, like the realization sinking into my bones. And I remember the time we drove down the Pacific Coast Highway in our old Honda Civic listening to Fleetwood Mac on cassette, and I thought we had a lifetime of moments like that ahead of us. And suddenly I wondered if those moments had been real at all, or if they had just been a rehearsal for this betrayal. And I could see the way Sarah was, leaning in too close, and how he didn't pull away, and I felt my heart break in a slow, relentless way, like a record scratching over the sweetest song. And I whispered under my breath, "You can't do this," but I wasn't sure if I was telling him or reminding myself of the truth. And I thought about calling my friend Linda in Pasadena to tell her what was happening, but I didn't want anyone to know yet. I wanted to burn with the secret and see what happened next. And I noticed a security guard at the elevator watching us with an unreadable expression, and I wondered if he knew too. And in that moment, a thought flashed in my mind that maybe, just maybe, I had more power than I realized, and that whatever came next, I would go down quietly. And I clenched the lilies so tightly the stems bent, and I took a deep, shaky breath and told myself, in 15 minutes, everything will be different, and you'll see who really has the power here. And I looked at him one more time, and the look on his face said nothing. And I thought about all the mornings I made him. Breakfast at 6:15 a.m. before he left for client meetings, and now none of it mattered. And the words he would soon say to justify himself would never undo this scene. And I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in my ears like a warning drum. And I remembered the anniversary trip to New Orleans when he got us lost for 3 hours on Bourbon Street. And I laughed and forgave him because I loved him so much, and now the same love felt like a trap tightening around my chest, and I realized that love alone wouldn't save me from this moment. And I wondered if he had ever truly loved me, or if it had been part of performance all along. And the red coat woman laughed again, and it made me shiver. And I thought about the time I saved $2,350 to buy that vintage 1968 Polaroid camera he always wanted. And now the camera sat in our apartment like a monument to my foolish trust, and I swallowed hard and whispered, "What happens next changes everything." And I looked around for witnesses, hoping someone would see what I was seeing, because maybe that would make it real. Maybe it would make him understand that someone was watching. And it wasn't just me in the lobby. It was suddenly too bright, too loud, too cruel. And I felt my hands burn from holding the flowers, and my eyes sting from tears. I refused to let fall, and I said under my breath, "If anyone has ever felt invisible in their own life, you know this moment, this exact twisting pit of betrayal." And I stepped closer, pretending to tie my shoe to gather courage. And when I stood up, I was ready to confront the truth, ready to shake the world around me, ready to see if I could survive this betrayal. And in 15 minutes, everything would be revealed, and I whispered one last time to the empty lobby. If you've ever lived through this kind of shock, comment below, because I need to know I'm not alone. I remember the morning I met him in 1987 at that tiny electronics shop on Main Street, Scranton, Pennsylvania. I was 16 with a pink ribbon in my hair, and he was 22 wearing a navy blue jacket that smelled faintly of motor oil, and after I accidentally dropped a stack of VHS tapes, he bent down to help me, and his hands were warm and strong. And I felt something inside me stir that I hadn't felt before, and from that moment, I knew life would never be the same, and over the years I gave. Everything I had to make us a family, a home, and a life worth remembering. I remember spending 3 full Saturdays sanding the old oak floors in our first apartment on Cedar Avenue, saving $246 from my waitress job at the diner to buy the proper stain, because he had always loved darkwood, and I thought that kind of effort was part of love, and he noticed and smiled, and I felt proud, and we used to dance in the living room to Elvis Presley records, pretending the small apartment was a ballroom in Las Vegas. And when we moved to Los Angeles in 1995, I worked overtime at the consulting firm, bringing home $2,143.87 every month to cover half the rent and utilities, so he could pursue his dream of starting a small tech company. And I never thought twice about the sacrifices, because I believed in US, I believed in what we built, and the street where we lived in Wilshire Heights smelled of freshly cut grass every Sunday morning, and I would make him coffee at 6:15 a.m. while he got ready for client meetings, and sometimes I would stand by the window watching the city wake up and thinking about how lucky I was that he trusted me to handle so much of the household and financial planning, even though he was the one with the title and the office corner overlooking downtown. I remember clearly the time he asked me to invest $12,500 into a startup idea, which I saved over 2 years from my consulting bonuses. And even though I hesitated, I said yes because I trusted him and believed in his vision. And I remember the pride in his eyes the night we celebrated with 3 friends at that small Italian restaurant on 8th Street. And I cooked lasagna for everyone as a thank you gesture. And he kept saying, "I couldn't have done this without you." And I believed every word, and all those moments built the scaffolding of my life around him. And even when he got promoted to senior VP in 2003 at the firm downtown, I arranged a surprise party at the Intercontinental Hotel with 57 colleagues and even coordinated the catering and decorations. And when he walked in and saw everyone clapping, he hugged me and whispered, "You always make everything better." And I thought that my life's purpose was intertwined with his happiness. And the way he laughed back then, full and unguarded, made me feel like I could survive anything. And the neighborhood friends would always comment on how devoted we were, how I always had a smile and a casserole for new neighbors, and how he always praised my cooking even when it wasn't perfect. And I remember the smell of the baked apples on Thanksgiving 2007, the aroma filling our Wilshire Heights home, and the children we had laughed running around the table. And I had stayed up until 2 a.m. preparing the pumpkin pie and cranberry sauce. And he didn't lift a finger because he said it was my talent. And I felt proud, but also tired and sometimes unnoticed, but always believing it was love. I also remember driving him to the LAX airport at 5:50 a.m. in the pouring rain, because he had a 6:30 a.m. flight to San Francisco for a critical client presentation, and he had forgotten his briefcase. And I ran back to the car 3 times with his files, umbrella, and coffee, and he looked at me with tired eyes and said, "I don't know what I'd do without you." And I believed that too. And even on the days I was sick, I would still make it to his office in Century City at 7:45 a.m. carrying breakfast and reviewing spreadsheets with him. And sometimes I would linger in the lobby for a few minutes just to see him smile and feel like my presence mattered. And those were the moments that made every small sacrifice worth it, and the hours I spent making sure our finances were secure, our home inviting, and our family happy felt invisible now. When I think about that Tuesday morning in October 2024, when I walked into the lobby at exactly 8:37 a.m. with pink lilies in hand and saw him laughing with someone else, and in those memories the contrast was so cruel, the contrast between 15 years of unwavering dedication and a single instant of betrayal. And if you've ever devoted yourself so completely to someone and felt invisible, I want you to hold on and wait, because what happened next changed everything. And I promise you won't believe the next chapter. But first, just imagine walking into a world you built with your own hands and realizing it might not be yours anymore. I thought I knew everything about him after 22 years together after the 1999 summer. We spent 3 weeks renovating the guest bathroom in our Wilshire Heights home, where I personally chose the $732.48 subway tiles and the vintage brass fixtures because he loved that old Hollywood aesthetic, and he said it reminded him of his grandmother's house in Savannah, Georgia. And I worked late nights at the consulting firm, saving $1,456 each month just to cover unexpected expenses for our home. Improvement projects, and even though I was exhausted, I loved the way he would come home and smile and say, "You have magic in your hands," and I believed it because I put everything I had into making our life beautiful. And then there were the trips we took to Portland, Maine in 2008 when he was invited to speak at the tech convention. And I spent $3,214.67 for plane tickets, hotels, and rental cars. So he could present without worrying about logistics, and I stayed in a little inn called the Harbor View. In watching the waves crash against the cliffs and feeling proud of the man he was becoming. And I thought love was about these sacrifices and being present in the background and never asking for acknowledgement. And I would leave little notes in his briefcase every Monday morning with reminders and words of encouragement. And sometimes I would bake banana bread at 5:45 a.m. and leave it on the kitchen counter with a post-it saying, "You got this," and he would read it and nod and smile. But sometimes he would forget to even say thank you or mention it. And I would laugh it off thinking he was busy or distracted. And even when he started to come home later and later from the office, sometimes 17 p.m. on Thursdays after board meetings, I would cook his favorite meals and set the table with the candles he loved and the crystal glasses that cost $417.32 each because they made him feel important and special. And I never questioned the little disappearances of time or phone calls he took outside the house. I trusted him implicitly, and when he first mentioned bringing someone new into the office team in 2015, I didn't think much of it. I even helped him pick out welcome gifts of $54.95 each for new employees and baked cookies for the reception, so everyone would feel included, and I thought that was normal. I thought that was just life and support, and then came subtle things like the way he would answer my calls with a slightly too short tone, or the way he would sometimes forget our Saturday morning coffee ritual on Sunset Boulevard after 7:30 a.m. yoga class when I had already reserved a table at Cafe Gratitude, and I would feel that twinge in my chest, but rationalize it as being tired or preoccupied with work or stress. And even when a friend in the neighborhood remarked, "I don't know how you put up with him working so much," I would say, "He's under pressure, I understand." And these little cracks in his attention never seemed worth confronting. And then there was the time I spent $1,214.89 on surprise tickets for the Fleetwood Mac reunion concert in San Francisco in 2019 and spent hours coordinating travel and accommodations for 4 days. And he barely smiled when we got there and said, "Thanks, I guess," and I wrote it off because he was tired or maybe stressed, and I thought love was about understanding even when unappreciated. And I remember my parents saying, "Always invest in people you love because one day it will come back to you." And I believe them wholeheartedly. And every day I try to make sure he felt supported financially, emotionally, and socially, even introducing him to my contacts from Pasadena and Century City to grow his career. And I always stayed quiet when he made offhand comments about my wardrobe choices or the amount of time I spent at home, making sure everything ran smoothly. I would simply nod and say okay or sure, and never let it affect the calm exterior I maintained. And I remember the summer of 2012 when I spent exactly 67 hours refurbishing his childhood bicycle that he kept in the garage from when he was 10 years old and painted it cherry red with gold accents. And he smiled once in passing, but never really thanked me, and yet I did it because I wanted to bring joy and nostalgia into his life. And in hindsight, those were the first signs that my sacrifices were invisible and the first hints that I was becoming background noise in the story of our life, and I still told myself it was fine. Because love requires patience and understanding. And I remembered October 2020 when I gifted him the limited edition Mont Blanc pen for his promotion, and he barely looked up from his phone and muttered, "Thanks." And that tiny dismissive word stung more than I wanted to admit, and all of these moments added up like tiny drops in a glass until that Tuesday morning in October 2024 when I walked into the lobby at exactly 8:37 a.m. with pink lilies in my hand, and saw him laughing with her, and every tiny dismissive gesture over the years hit me like a hammer. And I realized that I had been justifying everything for too long. And if you've ever spent your life supporting someone and felt invisible, just wait until you see what happens next, because the injustice is about to escalate, and you'll feel every ounce of betrayal I felt. I had never felt such a cold weight in my chest as I walked those last 3 steps to the reception desk at my husband's office building on 5th Avenue, New York City, at exactly 8:39 a.m., holding the pink lilies that had been meant to surprise him and make him smile. And I noticed immediately how the elevator doors reflected his posture and the woman in the red coat, leaning casually against his arm like she owned the space, and I could hear her laugh, and it was sharper, now more deliberate, and I realized she was enjoying this little theater she had been invited into without even knowing the script, and I cleared my throat and tried to call his attention to my presence, and he looked at me and said, "Oh, hey, honey, I didn't expect you here." And I smiled nervously and said, "I thought I would bring you some flowers and lunch." And he nodded and glanced at her, and I could feel the dismissal in the way he said, "Sure, maybe later." And my stomach dropped like the floor had disappeared beneath me, and I noticed a security guard by the elevator watching silently, but not intervening. And I could feel the eyes of 3 colleagues in the lobby peering curiously over the edge of the reception counter. And I knew at least some of them were seeing exactly what I was seeing. And I wanted to scream, but I forced myself to stay calm, because I had always believed dignity was my shield. And then she spoke directly to him, laughing, and said, "Did you see the email I sent last night about the Johnson account?" And he leaned in close and whispered something I couldn't hear, and she giggled and brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. And my hands clenched the lilies so tightly I could feel the stems bending. And I remember the 2017 summer, when I spent 2 whole weekends repainting the office walls in our home, so he could have a proper workspace for his Zoom calls. And now I was standing in his actual office building and felt utterly invisible, like all that effort had never existed. And I stepped forward and said softly, "Do you have a minute for me?" And he glanced at me and said, "Can it wait? I'm busy." And I felt the first real sting of humiliation in front of strangers, and the woman in red smirked and whispered something, and he laughed and nodded, and my ears burned, and I wanted to disappear into marble floor, and the lobby felt suddenly too large and too cold, and I noticed a clock on the wall said 8:41 a.m., and I thought how 15 minutes ago I had walked in full of hope, and now I wanted to crawl under the reception desk and cry. And I remembered all the Saturday mornings I had spent preparing breakfast for him before 6 a.m. client calls, and every carefully arranged plate and coffee cup felt like a mockery now, and I could see one of the janitors watching from across the hall, pretending not to stare, but clearly aware of the tension. And I remembered the time I spent $1,097.65 buying and wrapping birthday gift for him that he had tossed into a drawer without a glance, and suddenly it all came rushing back, and the subtle way he had been dismissive over the years crystallized into this sharp, piercing humiliation. And I took a shaky breath and said, "Maybe we can talk later," and turned slightly to leave, but he called after me, "Don't be dramatic, it's nothing." And I froze and felt my cheeks burn red with shame and anger, and the woman in red tilted her head and smiled in that knowing way people do when they see someone faltering in their own life story. And I thought about the nights I stayed up until 2:13 a.m. balancing spreadsheets and making sure our finances were in order, and now I felt like all that diligence meant nothing. And I noticed a receptionist glancing nervously at me like she knew something was off, but unsure what to do, and I felt a wave of betrayal mixed with disbelief, and I wanted to collapse into tears, but I held my ground and said softly, "I just want to surprise you." And he shrugged and muttered, "It's fine, I guess," and I felt the cold slap of dismissal like a whip against my heart. And at that moment, I realized that 15 years of sacrifice could be dismissed in 30 seconds of indifference, and the subtle murmurs of witnesses started to make the humiliation real and tangible, and the smell of brewed coffee mingled with the expensive perfume of the red coat, and it felt like salt in an open wound, and I whispered under my breath, "Espir 8 vosaver okayak and tisa segir," because the injustice was only beginning, and if you've ever felt invisible in a place where you belong, just wait, because the next moments will make you ache with every ounce of empathy you have for someone who gave everything and received so little. I couldn't believe what was happening as I stepped fully into the lobby of the Century City office building at 8:43 a.m. with the pink lilies now slightly crushed in my hand, and he continued to laugh with her as if I wasn't even there, and I could hear him whispering something about the new marketing strategy, and she leaned in closer, and I noticed the way he rested his hand on her shoulder just slightly too long, and I felt a twisting knot of disbelief and fury in my stomach, and I remembered the dollar 2,143. I had saved over 2 years to buy him the vintage watch he always wanted for his 40th birthday, and he had worn it twice since giving it to him and never once mentioned again. And now here he was in the middle of the lobby being charming to someone else like all those efforts were invisible, and I saw the receptionist glance nervously at the security camera and then at me, and I realized this wasn't just private betrayal, this was public humiliation, and I could see 3 colleagues from his department hovering near the coffee machine pretending to be busy, but their eyes were fixed on us, and I remembered the time I spent 67 hours repainting the office walls in our home. So he could have a proper workspace, and now I felt every single one of those hours mocked in a single glance from him, and I took a step forward and said, "I brought you flowers," and he looked at me like I was an annoying distraction and said, "Oh, those are nice, I guess," and my heart sank like a stone into a deep river. And the woman in red laughed softly and whispered, "He's always been a bit oblivious," and I realized that the casual cruelty of this moment was amplified by witnesses, and I felt exposed like never before, and then he laughed at something she said, and I could see the sparkle of recognition in her eyes, the kind of sparkle reserved for secret victories, and I remember driving him to the airport at 5:50 a.m. in the rain with all his files and coffee, an umbrella, and he had whispered, "I don't know what I'd do without you." And now it all felt like mockery, and I swallowed hard trying to maintain my composure, while the security guard by the elevator raised an eyebrow, and a janitor across the hall glanced knowingly, and I could feel every ounce of indignation and humiliation mingling in the pit of my stomach, and I clenched the lilies even tighter, and they bent further under pressure of my fingers. I thought about the thousands of dollars I had spent buying tickets for his business, conferences in San Francisco, New York, and Portland, Maine over the past 15 years, just so he could attend without worrying about logistics. And now those efforts felt like nothing more than paper in the wind, and I took a shaky breath and tried to speak again and said, "Can we talk for a moment?" And he waved his hand dismissively and said, "I'm busy." And the woman in red tilted her head and smiled like she knew she had already won. And I noticed a passerby filming the scene on their phone, pretending to check the time, but clearly capturing everything, and my cheeks burned, and I wanted to disappear into marble floor. And I remembered cooking lasagna for him and his friends on 8th Street when he had achieved his promotion at the Intercontinental Hotel, and how he had hugged me once and whispered, "You make everything better." And now I felt like that person never existed, and I felt my knees buckle slightly as the realization hit me that 15 years of dedication could be wiped away in a single moment. And then he said out loud, laughing, "It's just a small thing, don't make a big deal." And I felt my chest tighten so severely I could barely breathe, and the woman in red laughed again softly like it was an inside joke at my expense, and I could see the reflection of the security camera catching everything, and I realized this wasn't private anymore, this was public, and I whispered under my breath, "If you've ever been humiliated in front of strangers, you know this pain." And I remembered all the early mornings, 6:15 a.m., making coffee, breakfast, and leaving notes in his briefcase, and the weekend night spent organizing his office so he could impress clients, and every single one of those acts now felt meaningless, and I felt my hands burn from the stems of the lilies, and the lobby suddenly felt too bright, too loud, too cruel, and I knew I had reached the absolute apex of humiliation when the receptionist muttered under her breath, "I've never seen anything like this," and I realized witnesses were now fully part of the story, and the injustice had reached a crescendo, and I whispered again to myself, "This is a line I will not cross quietly, because the next moment will be the turning point, and the next chapter will show how I began to awaken and reclaim the power they thought I had lost forever." As I stood in that lobby at exactly 8:46 a.m. with the crushed pink lilies in my hand and watched him lean in to whisper something to her, I felt a strange shift inside me like a spark flickering after years underwater, and suddenly the humiliation and disbelief that had weighed on me for 15 years transformed into something sharper, clearer, almost electric, and I straightened my shoulders and lifted my chin, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I looked at him not with hope, not with love, not with fear, but with clarity, and I noticed the way the expensive marble floor beneath my feet seemed to support me instead of swallow me. And I realized that all those years of sacrifices of early mornings, late nights, financial investments, and emotional labor had not left me powerless. They had built me a foundation stronger than his arrogance, and the sparkle in her eyes no longer intimidated me, it irritated me, and I felt a calm energy coursing through my veins like molten metal, and I took a slow, deep breath, inhaling the aroma of brewed coffee mixed with the sharp perfume of her red coat, and felt the tension in my body shift from helplessness to readiness. And I remember the time I had secretly invested $25,000 into a tech fund while he was busy with clients in San Francisco, thinking it was just a hobby, and now I realize that fund had grown over $82,760. $4.50, and the power it represented suddenly made sense to me, and I looked at him and his confident posture and laughed. Softly under my breath, a low, controlled sound that made me feel alive for the first time that morning. And I saw the subtle shift in the way the receptionist glanced at me, noticing something had changed in my presence, and the janitor across the hall stopped sweeping, pretending to tie his shoes, but clearly observing the scene, and I felt my heartbeat slow and strengthen at the same time, and I realized that I didn't need to plead or beg or justify myself anymore, because I had resources, intelligence, and support I had underestimated for years, and humiliation that had crushed me moments before now fueled me like jet fuel. And I remember the secret contacts I had built quietly over the years in Century City and Pasadena, and even my own connections in corporate law and finance, and I realized that they could tip the scales in my favor if I chose to act, and I felt a thrill that replaced the old fear in my chest, and I noticed the first flicker of panic in his eyes as he realized my demeanor was no longer submissive, and the woman in red straightened, as if sensing the shift in energy, and I took a step closer and felt the marble floor cold under my feet, but solid and unyielding, and I whispered to myself, "This is a moment I stopped being invisible," and I felt a wave of empowerment ripple through my body, and I remembered every early morning breakfast I had made, every hour I had spent organizing his life, and suddenly those acts of love felt like investments in my own strength, and I felt the clarity that all this humiliation was temporary. The power had always been in me, and now I was awake to it, and I noticed subtle signs in the lobby, the security cameras, catching everything the receptionist, realizing I wasn't going to cower the janitor pausing his sweep, all witnesses now unknowingly waiting for my next move, and I straightened the flowers in my hand, and saw them no longer as symbols of vulnerability, but as tools of my presence and assertion, and I whispered again under my breath, "I won't be invisible anymore." And I felt a small but undeniable smile creep across my face, and my chest tighten with controlled energy, and I realized that the very people who thought they were watching me fall were now witnessing the awakening of someone who had quietly amassed power for years. And I felt the first sparks of strategy form in my mind, the steps I would take to reclaim control, the way I would assert myself without losing dignity, the contacts I would quietly call the evidence I would gather, and I felt the air around me shift, and suddenly the lobby didn't feel hostile anymore. It felt like a stage for the next act in which I would not be the victim, but the force that changed everything. And I noticed the first whispers among witnesses as they sensed something was different, and I thought, they have no idea what's coming. And I smiled again and whispered softly to myself, "Espirate vocever ok acentis a seguir porque justica esta pressa cumcar." I stood there in the Century City lobby at exactly 8:49 a.m., holding the pink lilies that were now bent and slightly bruised, but still vibrant, and I felt a calm I had never felt before, like a tide that had been building for years had finally swept over me and washed away the fear and the self-doubt. And I realized that the humiliation of the past minutes was temporary, but my power was permanent, and I remembered the secret account I had opened 5 years ago, quietly in Los Angeles with $15,000 I had set aside from consulting bonuses and small stock investments, and how over the years it had quietly grown to $68,412.37. And I realized that I had quietly been preparing for exactly this moment, and that the strength I needed was in my hands and mind all along. And I straightened my shoulders and lifted my chin and felt every witness in the lobby sensing the change, and the subtle shift was palpable. The receptionist glanced up and realized I wasn't going to crumble. The janitor paused in mid-sweep, pretending to adjust his broom, but his eyes tracked me, and I could see the faintest flicker of unease in the security guard, and I knew that even small displays of power were starting to ripple through the space. And I took a slow, controlled breath and decided that I would act not from anger or revenge, but with precision and dignity. And I thought about the contacts I had quietly nurtured over the years in Century City and Pasadena law, offices and corporate circles, and how they could support me if necessary. And I felt the first real taste of strategic empowerment. And then I remembered the evidence I had kept over the years, small receipts, little notes, emails that had quietly documented every slight, every dismissal, every moment I had been invisible, and I realized that these would now serve as my proof, my leverage, and my shield. And I looked at him and the woman in red again and felt no fear, only clarity, and I took another step forward and felt the marble floor solid under my feet, and the flowers in my hand felt like tools of assertion. And I whispered softly to myself, I will not be invisible anymore. And I felt the thrill of control spread to me like fire through dry brush, and I began to formulate my plan, each step carefully, each move deliberate. And I noticed how his posture changed slightly as he sensed a shift my calm but undeniable presence, signaling that this was no longer the same woman. He thought he knew, and the woman in red tensed slightly and leaned back, and I smiled subtly inside because the balance of power was beginning to tilt in my favor, and I recalled the times I had prepared client presentations for him. Without recognition, the hundreds of hours of organizing his calendar, arranging dinners, networking events, trips to New York, Portland, and San Francisco, and all the meticulous attention to detail I had given without fanfare, and I realized that all those investments were not wasted. They had quietly built the arsenal I now commanded, and I could feel the energy in my body settling into a rhythm of strategy and anticipation. And I took another deep breath and looked at the witnesses again, the receptionist, the colleagues by the coffee machine, the janitor. And I realized that they would remember this shift even if they didn't know the details, and that public perception was subtly aligning with me, and I noticed the sparkle in my own eyes when I met his gaze for the first time without a fear or pleading, and I felt the first seeds of control take root and grow, and I whispered under my breath, in a few moments they will see who holds the real power here. And I straightened the lilies again, feeling them no longer as fragile flowers, but as symbols of presence and assertion. And I realized that the next move would define everything, the culmination of 15 years of dedication, and the first conscious act of reclaiming dignity and strategy. And I smiled slightly as the energy shifted fully inside me, and the thought struck me sharply and clearly that the humiliation had ended, the awakening had begun. And if you've ever felt powerless in a place you built with your own hands, wait until you see the next chapter, because the real story is just beginning. I felt the air shift in the Century City lobby at exactly 8:52 a.m., as if the marble walls themselves were acknowledging the change in me, and I straightened my shoulders and took another deliberate step forward, feeling the faint crackle of electricity in my fingertips, and I reached into my bag and pulled out a small leather fold of the kind I had been keeping hidden in my office for years, full of emails, screenshots, receipts, and carefully documented proof of every slight and dismissal, every overlooked effort, every tiny humiliation that had piled up over the past 15 years. And I held it just long enough for the receptionist to notice the leather glint, and I saw the subtle lift of her eyebrows, and the janitor paused mid-sweep, and the security guard stiffened slightly, and I realized that even the smallest reveal could ripple through the room and start to shift perception in my favor. And I stepped closer to him and the woman in red and said softly but firmly, I think we need to review these. And he looked at me for a fraction of a second with amusement, and then a flicker of something else crossed his face, a hint of worry, curiosity, fear. I couldn't place exactly, and the woman in red leaned back slightly, as if sensing an unexpected threat. And I opened the folder slowly, letting a few sheets peek out, just enough of them to catch the faint shine of highlighted text numbers and dates. And I saw the sparkle of surprise on the receptionist's face as she glanced at the documents without understanding their full context, but recognizing the authority emanating from me. And I continued calmly, I've documented everything meticulously, every flight, every dinner, every misacknowledgement, every financial contribution. And I think it's time this was clear to everyone involved. And I could feel the first tremor of power as their eyes widened slightly, and he straightened abruptly and whispered something to her, and I caught just enough to hear the hesitation in his voice. And I felt a thrill of validation coursing through me, because the imbalance that had weighed on me for 15 years was beginning to correct itself in real time. And I remembered the $82,764.50 that had quietly grown in the tech fund I invested in when he was busy with clients. And suddenly I realized I had more leverage than I had ever allowed myself to acknowledge, and the subtle nods from the receptionist, the slight stiffening of the janitor, and the way a passerby holding a coffee cup stepped aside, as if sensing the storm, all confirmed what I had feared and hoped at the same time that public perception could be quietly aligned with my awakening. And I opened the folder wider and let the dates and figures shine in the lobby light and whispered, every detail matters, every effort is documented, and now it's time to be recognized. And I felt the first pulse of fear in him as he realized the depth of what I held, and the woman in red tensed visibly and took a step back, and I felt a surge of calm control because the power I had cultivated silently for years was now undeniable, even to those who thought they were in control, and I could see his jaw tighten slightly, and the way his confident posture faltered just a fraction, and the receptionist's subtle glance toward the elevator suggested she sensed the shift too, and I took a slow, deliberate breath, feeling the solid marble beneath my feet, the faint scent of brewed coffee, and the sharp perfume of red coat around me, and I realized that this was only the beginning of what I could do with patient strategy and careful revelation, and I whispered softly under my breath, "If this surprises you, imagine what's coming next." And I felt the thrill of authority building inside me as all the little humiliations and dismissals the invisible years now fueled an unstoppable sense of control, and the lobby that felt hostile just minutes ago now seemed to bend subtly to my presence, as if acknowledging that the narrative was finally mine too. Command, and I knew that the first signs of power had been noticed, and that from here the full revelation would unfold, and every witness would understand the weight of years spent invisible and the quiet authority I had cultivated. And if you've ever felt powerless waiting for the right moment, watch closely, because the next chapter will show what happens when invisible strength becomes undeniable presence. I took a deep breath at exactly 8:55 a.m. and stepped fully into the center of the Century City lobby, holding the leather folder open so the documents were visible, and I felt the quiet authority that had been building for years now radiating from me like sunlight through fog. And he froze mid-step. The woman in red instinctively stepped back, and even the receptionist paused mid-motion, pretending to organize papers, but her eyes widened in recognition of the shift, and I said clearly but calmly, "I've documented every dinner, flight, meeting, gift contribution, and every slight you have overlooked over the last 15 years, including the $82,764.50 tech fund I quietly invested in for our security, the exact amounts I spent on birthdays, Christmas conferences, and home renovations, and every note I left for encouragement, and every effort that went unacknowledged." And I let my gaze sweep across the lobby, slowly observing every reaction, and I saw the first flicker of genuine fear cross his face. The kind that comes when someone finally realizes they've underestimated someone for far too long. And the woman in red looked like she had just been caught in a lie. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out, and I felt a thrill as the receptionist adjusted her posture, slightly leaning closer to witness the unfolding drama, and I held the folder higher, letting the light catch the highlights of the figures and dates, and whispered softly, "Every single effort meticulously tracked, every sacrifice accounted for, and now it's impossible to ignore." And I could see the slight tremble in his hands, a rigidness in his stance, and I realized the balance of power had flipped entirely, and the murmurs from the colleagues near the coffee machine grew louder, but I ignored them and focused on the undeniable authority I now embodied. And then I produced my phone and showed a string of emails and texts confirming past conversations, commitments, and acknowledgments he had promised but never delivered, and I could see the realization dawn on him that every misstep, every slight, every dismissal was now irrefutable, and the woman in red's face turned pale, and I noticed a passerby holding a latte stopping to stare as the tension radiated beyond the lobby, and I continued calmly. "And for those who might doubt the legitimacy of my documentation, the legal team I have quietly consulted is ready to verify every single claim if necessary." And I watched as his confident posture crumbled, and he muttered, "I didn't realize." And I felt a wave of vindication wash over me because 15 years of invisible effort had finally been acknowledged through undeniable evidence and calm authority. And I felt the thrill of control pulse through me as I closed the folder slowly and let the gravity of the moment settle across everyone in the room, and the security guard's subtle shift in stance confirmed he too sensed the power had shifted, and the janitor paused in mid-sweep, staring openly now, and the receptionist discreetly covered her mouth, but her eyes betrayed astonishment, and I realized that even without raising my voice, I had turned humiliation into authority and invisibility into presence. And the woman in red finally whispered, "How did you?" And he stammered, "I didn't." And I smiled slightly because their confusion was perfect confirmation of my strategy and years of preparation, and I felt the energy in the lobby settle into a new rhythm, the rhythm of respect, recognition, and power regained, and I whispered softly under my breath, "Never again will I be invisible." And I realized fully that the humiliation of the past minutes had been necessary to unlock this transformation. And as I looked around at the witnesses, the subtle nods of acknowledgement, the wide eyes of recognition that I had emerged stronger and strategically prepared filled me with a quiet satisfaction. And I knew that this was just the beginning of reclaiming dignity and authority, and that the true impact of this revelation would echo far beyond this lobby, and every observer would remember the moment the balance shifted irrevocably. And if you've ever felt invisible, underestimated, or dismissed, know that the right time your power will emerge, and the next chapter will show how justice unfolds immediately and the consequences become undeniable for everyone who thought they were untouchable. At exactly 8:58 a.m., I felt the weight of the lobby shift, as if the marble walls themselves were acknowledging the change in balance, and I watched him take a step back, and the woman in red adjust her scarf nervously, and I realized that the evidence I had displayed moments ago was already working like a lever, shifting perception of everyone present, and I could see the receptionist subtly leaning forward, glancing at the documents again, her eyes wide with surprise, and a faint nod of understanding, and I felt a thrill, because the witnesses were silently validating what I had spent years building quietly in the background, and I opened my phone and dialed one of my trusted legal contacts from Pasadena, and let the line ring a few seconds, so they could hear the background commotion, and I could see his eyes widen, slightly realizing that this was no longer a private confrontation. This was escalation into official channels if necessary, and I calmly said, "I need confirmation on these documents for review. They are ready for validation immediately." And as I hung up, I could see the subtle panic in his posture, the way his confident facade faltered, and I realized that the first real consequences were unfolding already, and the woman in red shifted uncomfortably and glanced toward the elevator as if considering an escape route. And I noticed a few colleagues stepping closer with curiosity and a sense of collective witnessing building in the air, and I felt the power in those. Silent affirmations rippled through me like electricity, and I reminded myself quietly of the $82,764.50 tech fund that had grown over the years, and the $68,412.37 secret count, and how even small strategic financial leverage could reinforce authority without a word spoken. And I stepped closer and said softly but clearly, "These records are verified and can be validated at any moment if required." And I could see the first tremor of fear in him, his lips parting slightly as he stammered, I didn't realize the extent." And the woman in red looked at him sharply and muttered, "We need to step back." And I felt the tide of justice beginning to sweep through the room, and the receptionist discreetly reached for her phone, as if to capture the unfolding accountability. And I remembered all the hours I'd spent preparing meticulous records of every gift, every flight, every dinner, every consultation, every small detail he had ignored, and I realized now those hours were not wasted. They were armor and proof and a tool for restoring balance. And I felt my chest tighten with controlled energy and noticed the janitor pause mid-sweep, fully attentive, now pretending to adjust his broom, but clearly watching. And I whispered softly under my breath, "The first wave of justice is already visible." And I felt the subtle alignment of perception around me like gravity shifting. And I knew that colleagues walking past the lobby would see the ripple of authority, and witnesses outside the building would feel it too, and I realized the humiliation he had caused would now be mirrored in accountability if he continued to underestimate me. And I stepped back slightly, letting the presence of calm control radiate from me, and I noticed the first subtle gestures of support from nearby colleagues, a nod, a small smile, a moment of recognition that I was no longer the one being dismissed, and I felt the thrill of validation and justice mingling with a quiet satisfaction. And I realized that this was only the beginning, that the consequences of years of underestimation were unfolding in real time, and that every step I took from this moment would be watched and every word measured. And I whispered again, "Espir et vose ver ok acantis a seguir porque a justica gora esse torna publica e inescapable." And I felt the marble floor solid beneath me, and the flowers in my hand now felt like banners of authority and assertion, and I knew that even without raising my voice, the balance had begun to shift irrevocably, and that the first whispers of accountability were already spreading through everyone who had been present. And I felt a quiet smile creep across my face, because the humiliation was being replaced with recognition and validation, and the tide of justice was unstoppable now that the first domino had fallen. By 9:02 a.m., the lobby of the Century City building felt completely transformed, as if the marble walls themselves were reflecting the shift in authority, and I watched him pale noticeably, his shoulders sagging slightly, as if the weight of the last 15 years of ignored effort had finally landed squarely on him, and the woman in red clutched her folder, nervously stepping back from him, as though seeking protection from the storm that had quietly been building around us, and the receptionist now openly glanced at my documents, then at me, and nodded subtly in recognition of the control I now exerted, and I felt a thrill ripple through me, because the first dominoes of justice were falling, and I knew the momentum could not be stopped, and the janitor across the hall leaned against the railing pretending to check his shoes, but I could see the wide eyes and subtle nods acknowledging that something irreversible was happening, and I straightened the lilies in my hand, feeling them now as symbols of power and dignity, and I reminded myself quietly of the $68,412.37 account and the $82,764.50 tech fund, both quietly growing over years, and how those resources now gave me leverage beyond simple confrontation. And I opened the folder fully, letting the highlighted emails and receipts be visible to anyone who dared glance, and I said clearly, these records are verified, and every single item can be checked legally and publicly if needed, and I could see his hands tremble slightly, the tension in his jaw tightening as the weight of undeniable evidence and the eyes of witnesses bore down on him, and the woman, in red, whispered nervously, "We need to leave now." And he glanced around frantically, realizing that everyone present, the receptionist, the janitor colleagues near the coffee machine, even passers-by now aware of the tension, had witnessed a moment the power shifted irrevocably, and I felt the first real taste of public accountability, mixing with a quiet satisfaction because the humiliation that had been forced upon me was now mirrored and magnified for him. And I remembered every effort I had made for our family, for his career, every birthday dinner meticulously prepared, every travel arrangement carefully organized, every late night spent supporting his ambitions, and realized all those acts were finally recognized to the undeniable proof and presence I now held, and I saw subtle shifts among the witnesses, the receptionist straightening in her chair, colleagues whispering to each other, nodding, and acknowledging what had been hidden for years, and I felt the energy of collective recognition building around me like a tide, and I whispered softly under my breath, "Justice in real time looks like this," and I noticed a subtle panic in his eyes as he realized this wasn't temporary humiliation. This was a systemic recognition of imbalance and inequity, and I calmly stepped closer and said, "Every effort documented, every investment validated, and every slight accounted for," and the clarity in my voice caused him to flinch, and the woman in red paled further, and the janitor finally dropped the pretense of sweeping and openly stared, and I realized that witnesses were now an active part of the unfolding justice, not mere observers, and I smiled quietly, because 15 years of invisible work had become undeniable influence and authority. And as I glanced around the lobby, noticing the subtle whispers and the nods of recognition, I understood that not only had I reclaimed my dignity, I had set a precedent for accountability in this microcosm of the world, and I felt the thrill of impact, knowing the humiliation he had imposed on me was now fully reflected back in the eyes of every witness, and I whispered softly, "Never underestimate the quiet strength of someone who has been preparing in silence." And I felt a wave of calm power as the lobby's atmosphere fully shifted in my favor, and I realized that from now on the story would be remembered as the moment the balance changed, and everyone who thought themselves untouchable understood that power can be cultivated quietly and revealed decisively. And if you've ever been dismissed or underestimated, take note, because the impact of preparation, patience, and unwavering self-belief can transform humiliation into unstoppable authority. And the next chapter will show the lasting transformation and reflection that makes this story more than just a moment of revenge, but a lesson for life. By 9:10 a.m., the lobby of the Century City building felt like a completely different place, as if the echoes of humiliation had been replaced by the quiet hum of recognition and dignity. And I realized for the first time in years that the years of invisible work, the early mornings, late nights, financial contributions, emotional labor, and countless small sacrifices were not just acts of love. They were building blocks of authority and resilience, and I held the now slightly bent pink lilies in my hand and smiled softly, because they no longer symbolized vulnerability, but the quiet assertion of presence and power. And I thought about the $82,764.50 tech fund, the $68,412.37 account, and the carefully documented emails, receipts, and notes that all quietly accumulated over 15 years. And I realized that power often comes not from confrontation, but from preparation, patience, and consistent integrity. And I glanced around the lobby, seeing subtle nods of acknowledgement, the receptionist straightening her posture, colleagues whispering quietly but respectfully, and even the janitor pausing mid-step as if to witness the moment. And I understood that transformation is not only personal, it radiates outward when executed with calm authority and clarity, and I whispered softly under my breath, "Never again will I allow my presence to be dismissed." And I remember the countless birthdays, dinners, conferences, travel arrangements, and support I had provided over the years, and I felt a quiet pride knowing that those efforts had built the foundation for this moment of empowerment. And I looked at him and the woman in red and saw unmistakable recognition in their eyes of realization that underestimating someone who quietly prepares can be catastrophic. And I smiled slightly and felt the first real sense of closure and liberation in years. And I thought of everyone watching this unfold, even if only as witnesses in their own lives, and I realized that invisibility does not equate to powerlessness and patience preparation, and self-belief can turn humiliation into opportunity and authority. And I took a deep, slow breath, letting the aroma of coffee and faint perfume fill the air, and felt the marble floor solid beneath me. And I thought about the viewers at home who may have felt dismissed, overlooked, or underestimated for years, and I whispered, "If you've ever felt invisible, take note, because your quiet strength can change everything." And I raised my hand, slightly gesturing toward the space around me like a subtle nod to anyone who had ever been in my shoes, and I smiled softly because the story that had begun in humiliation ended in transformation and empowerment, and I reminded myself of all the lessons learned: patience, persistence, dignity, strategy, and courage, and I whispered again, "This is not just revenge, this is a lesson for life." And I thought of the people who had witnessed the shift firsthand, the receptionist, the janitor, the colleagues, the passers-by, and realized that accountability and justice can ripple further than we imagine. And I leaned slightly on the marble railing, feeling a quiet pride. And I thought about the viewers at home and said softly, as if to each of them individually, "If you've been underestimated, keep track of your efforts, plan carefully, prepare silently, and the right time will come for recognition and justice." And I smiled again because I understood fully that transformation is permanent when built on integrity and preparation. And I added the final thought for anyone who may be inspired. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to see it. Mark someone who's been underestimated and remind them of their quiet strength. And I felt the room settle into a calm aftershock, a collective exhale of acknowledgement and understanding, and I whispered finally, "Remember always that dignity earned patiently can never be taken away, and the next chapter of your life begins the moment you recognize your own power." And I looked down at the pink lilies one last time, feeling their petals soft and resilient, and I realized that life's humbling moments can transform into the most powerful lessons if we choose to act with patience, wisdom, and courage. And I said softly under my breath, "Subscribe to this channel for more stories of triumph. Leave your comment below and share your own story of overcoming invisibility. And always remember your strength is in what you have quietly built." And I felt a gentle smile spread across my face as the lobby buzzed softly around me. The past humiliation now transformed into permanent empowerment, and the story ended not with anger, but with clarity, dignity, and the certainty that I would never again be underestimated or invisible.